Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're tackling two big ideas in philosophy, phenomenology and hermeneutics. Yeah, they might sound kind of intimidating, but trust me, they're really relevant to how we understand the world. And we'll be drawing from excerpts from Husserl y Gadamer, Phenomenologia y Hermeneutica.
What I find fascinating is how these approaches see things from different angles.
Right.
Phenomenology encourages us to see the world directly, without all those assumptions we carry around.
Like with fresh eyes.
Yeah, exactly. But hermeneutics is more like, it says, hey, we're always looking through these colored glasses, whether we realize it or not.
So it's less about seeing things as they really are, and more about understanding how our perspectives shape what we see.
Exactly.
This is going to be good. But first, let's talk about Edmund Husserl, the guy who really got phenomenology rolling. The book makes him out to be this champion of his super rigorous scientific approach to philosophy.
Almost like he wanted to make philosophy as precise as math.
Which is interesting because,
well, he actually started out as a mathematician. Even worked with the famous Karl Weierstrass.
wow, so a math whiz turned philosopher. What happened there?
Seems like there was this pivotal moment, a conversion to philosophy, driven by intense religious experiences.
Okay, a mathematician turned philosopher with a religious side. Sounds like a pretty complex guy. But what did he actually contribute to philosophy? What were his big ideas?
Well, one of his main concerns was that philosophy had become too abstract, too detached from everyday life.
Okay, I can see that. So what did he propose? How do you ground philosophy in the messiness of lived experience?
That's where philosophical abstention comes in.
Philosophical abstention. What is that? Some kind of philosopher's version of a silent retreat?
It's similar in the sense that it involves mental discipline.
Okay.
So picture the cynical philosopher sitting in their armchair, pondering life's big questions. Husserl would say, hold on, have you even looked at your own assumptions about what a meaningful life even is?
So he's saying before we even try to answer the big questions,
we need to examine the questions themselves. Strip away all those preconceived notions and biases and really just observe our experiences as they happen.
that's a pretty radical idea, to question everything you think you know. How would you even begin to do that in everyday life?
Husserl believed it could be transformative. One concept he was really interested in was teleology. It's the idea that everything has an inherent purpose, like a built-in goal or direction.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure, think about a baby.
Okay.
Their natural curiosity and drive to explore the world.
That's their teleology.
Exactly. It's like this inherent drive within them.
I see. So Husserl believed that understanding the teleology of something, whether it's a baby's behavior or a complex philosophical idea, helps us to grasp its true essence and meaning.
Yeah. And Husserl's own thinking evolved over time, too. Initially, he was all about the immanence of consciousness.
The what of consciousness?
Immanence. It's like the internal workings of our minds. He thought we could unlock the secrets of reality by intensely analyzing our own thoughts and perceptions.
So it was all about looking inward.
Yeah, but he didn't stop there.
I was going to say, that seems a little limiting.
He eventually shifted towards something called transcendental phenomenology.
Transcendental phenomenology. Okay, that sounds even more complex.
It is a big step. It's where he acknowledged the interplay between consciousness and the world. He started to realize that while our subjective experiences are super important, we can't pretend that they exist in isolation. We're constantly interacting with the world, and those interactions influence how we understand things.
So it's less about retreating into your own mind and more about acknowledging the dynamic relationship between your inner world and the outer world.
Yeah. And he actually used these terms, noema and noesis, to describe this relationship.
Now, those sounded a little like science fiction terms to me when I saw them in the book.
They do sound a bit futuristic.
What do they mean exactly?
Well, noema refers to the object as we experience it.
Okay.
And noesis refers to the act of experiencing.
Okay, so let's say I'm looking at a tree. The tree as I see it, with all its details and my own personal perception, that would be the noema.
Yes, exactly.
And the act of me looking at it, the mental process of observing the tree, that's the noesis.
Precisely. He was making a distinction between the thing itself and our individual experience of that thing.
Which seems to connect back to that idea of stripping away assumptions to see things clearly.
Exactly. He believed that both are essential for true understanding. And there's another concept he introduced that I think is really fascinating, monads.
Monads.
Think of them as individual consciousnesses that are all interconnected.
Like nodes in a giant network.
Yes. All these individual perspectives contributing to a shared experience of the world.
So even though we each have our own unique point of view, those viewpoints are all part of this larger web of consciousness.
Right. It's like this constantly evolving tapestry.
Wow. Okay. So now we're moving on to Hans-Georg Gadamer and what the book calls the Hermeneutic Turn. Sounds like we're about to explore a completely different way of thinking about understanding.
We are. And Gadamer, who was a student of Heidegger, another important figure in phenomenology, actually took things in a very different direction. It's especially interesting considering he didn't have the easiest upbringing.
Really?
Yeah, his mother died when he was young, his brother had chronic illnesses, and his relationship with his father was strained.
That's a lot to deal with.
It is. But despite all that, he went on to become a leading figure in hermeneutics. It's basically the art of interpretation.
Okay, so how does this art of interpretation differ from phenomenology? I mean, they both seem to be about making sense of the world.
Well, remember how Husserl was all about setting aside our preconceptions?
To get to that pure experience, yeah.
Right. Gadamer argued that that's just not possible. He thought our understanding is always shaped by our existing beliefs, our culture, the traditions we inherit. It's like we're always looking through a lens that's been colored by our past.
So those colored glasses we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Gadamer's saying we can't just take them off.
Exactly.
So what does he say we should do?
He actually argued that our prejudices, and I don't mean that in a negative way,
Right.
but our pre-existing ways of understanding are essential for understanding.
Okay, that's a bit of a mind bender.
Think about it this way. When we read a book, for example, we're not just passively absorbing information.
Right. I mean, we're bringing our own thoughts and experiences to it.
Exactly. It's like a dialogue, a back and forth between the reader and the text.
So the reader is an active participant in creating meaning.
Yes.
That's interesting.
And Gadamer took this idea even further with his concept of a text having a history of effects.
Okay, history of effects. That sounds kind of dramatic.
It is a powerful idea. It acknowledges that a text's meaning isn't fixed.
So it can change over time.
It can. As different readers in different contexts bring their own interpretations to it, a book written centuries ago can still speak to us today, but its meaning will be influenced by how we, as modern readers, understand it.
So a text is never really finished. It's constantly having new conversations with new audiences. That's fascinating. But how does this all contrast with Husserl's view?
Well, Husserl was aiming for this pure, objective understanding of phenomena, but Gadamer embraced the messiness of interpretation. He believed our understanding is always going to be influenced by who we are and where we come from, our history and our culture. They're not obstacles to overcome. They're actually key parts of the process of understanding.
Okay, so we've got Husserl saying, let's try to see things as they truly are. And Gadamer saying, our understanding is always shaped by our individual lens. Sounds like we're setting the stage for a philosophical showdown.
It is a clash of perspectives.
A clash of titans.
But it offers a lot to think about. And both approaches have their own strengths and weaknesses.
Right, I'm sure exploring those will be really interesting, especially when we connect these ideas back to our own experiences as learners.
Exactly. So let's dive into how these contrasting approaches play out when we try to understand ourselves and our place in the world.
Okay, so with phenomenology, it's all about individual experience.
Right.
Stripping away all those layers of cultural conditioning and getting down to what it really means to be human.
Exactly. Husserl believed that if we carefully examined our own consciousness, we could uncover some universal truths about the human experience.
But wouldn't Gadamer say those universal truths are really just a product of our specific cultural and historical context?
He would. Gadamer argued that we can't separate ourselves from the traditions and prejudices we inherit. They're a part of who we are. So any attempt to get to a purely objective understanding of the world is going to be influenced by those things.
So it's almost like phenomenology is aiming for this pristine, unfiltered view of reality. And hermeneutics is like, hold on, our vision is always going to be a little blurry because of where we come from.
That's a great way to put it. And this difference also plays out in how we understand knowledge and truth. For Husserl, truth was something we could discover through careful observation and analysis.
So he'd say, if we're really diligent, we can get to the bottom of things, figure out what's really true.
Yes. He thought this process of discovery could lead us to a more objective, maybe even scientific understanding of the world.
But wouldn't Gadamer push back on that idea of a single objective truth?
Definitely. He'd argue that truth is always relative to our interpretive framework. What's true for one person might not be true for someone else, depending on their background, their experiences, their beliefs.
So truth is less like a fixed point and more like a fluid conversation,
Yeah.
shaped by the interaction of different viewpoints.
Exactly. And this takes us to the role of history, culture, and language in shaping how we understand things. For Husserl, those were potential sources of distortion, things that could cloud our perception of reality.
So going back to the colored glasses analogy, he'd want us to at least be aware of how they're affecting our vision.
Exactly. But Gadamer flips this on its head. For him, history, culture, and language aren't obstacles to overcome. They're actually what makes understanding possible in the first place.
So instead of trying to erase our cultural and historical background, Gadamer would say we need to understand it, acknowledge how it shapes our perceptions. It's like he's saying, hey, those colored glasses, they're part of your vision. Learn to use them.
That's a great way to put it. And finally, let's consider the relationship between individual consciousness and that shared reality we all experience. For Husserl, it all started with individual consciousness. He thought that by carefully examining our own thoughts and perceptions, we could build a picture of reality.
But didn't he also acknowledge that all those individual consciousnesses come together to create a shared world, like those interconnected monads?
He did, especially later in his work. But his focus remained on the individual as the starting point.
So he starts with the individual and then goes outward to see how individuals connect. Gadamer, on the other hand, seems to start with the collective.
Exactly. For Gadamer, we're already embedded in this web of relationships, traditions, shared experiences. Our individual consciousness is shaped by that. Our interactions with others, our language, our culture.
So there's no such thing as a purely individual consciousness. We're all products of our social environment.
Precisely. And he saw this interconnectedness as essential for understanding. We can't truly grasp ourselves or the world without considering those social and historical forces that shaped us.
Okay, so we've laid out these two really different perspectives. But I guess the big question is, which one is right? Which approach gets us closer to the truth about ourselves and the world?
I think framing it as a question of right or wrong misses the point. Phenomenology and hermeneutics both offer valuable insights. The key is understanding their strengths and limitations and seeing how they can work together.
So let's break it down. What are the pros and cons of each approach? Phenomenology's focus on direct experience seems really powerful. It encourages us to be more present, more aware of our surroundings, to really question what we think we know.
Yeah, it can be really powerful for self-discovery, for breaking free from those rigid ways of thinking. But there is a danger of being naive. If we ignore the influence of those pre-existing frameworks, those colored glasses, we might think we're seeing things clearly when we're not.
So it's about finding a balance, embracing the power of direct experience, but not mistaking your subjective perception for some objective truth.
Exactly.
Okay, now what about hermeneutics? What are its strengths and weaknesses?
Hermeneutics, with its focus on interpretation, offers a more nuanced view of understanding. It recognizes the complex factors that shape how we see things and encourages us to be more humble about what we claim to know.
So instead of clinging to this idea of one absolute truth, it embraces the idea that different interpretations can coexist, even enrich our understanding.
Precisely. But that emphasis on interpretation can lead to relativism, the idea that there are no objective standards of truth, that it all boils down to personal opinion.
And that seems like a slippery slope. I mean, if all interpretations are equally valid, how do we decide what to believe? How do we have meaningful debates or analyze things critically?
Those are valid concerns, and hermeneutics has struggled with that since the beginning. But Gadamer wasn't advocating for a kind of anything goes relativism. He thought that while our understanding will always be influenced by our perspective, we can still work towards a shared understanding through dialogue and open conversation.
So it's not about erasing our differences, but about finding ways to bridge them, to have productive conversations that challenge our assumptions and broaden our perspectives.
Exactly. And the book actually shares some interesting anecdotes about both Husserl and Gadamer, things that bring these concepts to life. For example, Husserl was deeply religious, despite being a champion of this very rigorous scientific approach to philosophy. He actually described his philosophical work as a path to God.
Wow, so there was a spiritual dimension to his thinking.
Absolutely. He saw philosophy as a moral imperative, a way to fight against ignorance.
Interesting. And what about Gadamer?
Gadamer was more of a pragmatist, less interested in building big philosophical systems and more focused on the practical side of interpretation.
So for him, it was less about abstract theories and more about using hermeneutics as a tool to navigate the real world.
Yeah, he thought true understanding required empathy. a willingness to see things from other people's point of view.
So even with all their differences, Husserl and Gadamer were both concerned with the same fundamental question. How do we make sense of the world and our place in it?
Exactly. And their work is still relevant today, especially as we navigate this increasingly complex and interconnected world. The real question is, what can we learn from these contrasting approaches? How can we apply these ideas to our own lives and our own search for knowledge?
Okay, so I've got these two really different frameworks, phenomenology and hermeneutics, both trying to shed light on how we understand the world. But they come at it from such different angles, it's almost like they're speaking different languages.
But as we've seen, there are some surprising connections between them. Remember Husserl's idea of monads, those interconnected individual consciousnesses?
Yeah.
That actually resonates with Gadamer's emphasis on dialogue and the idea that understanding is something we share.
Oh, that's true. So it's less like a battle between opposites, more like different sides of the same coin.
I like that. And I think the real challenge and the exciting part is trying to bring those different perspectives together. Instead of seeing them as separate, how can we combine them to get a richer understanding?
Okay, challenge accepted. But where do we even start with integrating these two seemingly opposite ideas?
Well, first, I think we need to recognize the limits of each approach.
Okay.
Phenomenology helps us become more aware of our own perceptions, but we have to be careful not to mistake those perceptions for some objective truth.
Right.
And hermeneutics reminds us that our understanding is always filtered through our own experiences, but we can't let that slip into just saying, well, anything goes.
So finding that balance.
Yeah, we need to be both rigorous in our observations and humble in our interpretations.
And how do we do that? Find that balance.
I think dialogue is key.
Dialogue. You mean like actually talking to people?
Exactly. Having open and honest conversations with people who see things differently than we do.
Because
That's how we challenge our own assumptions, how we expand our understanding.
it's like instead of just staying in our own little bubbles,
Right.
we need to get out there and engage with different perspectives.
That's where the real learning happens.
Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive into phenomenology and hermeneutics, we started with Husserl, urging us to really observe the world with fresh eyes.
And then we looked at Gadamer, who emphasized that our understanding is always going to be shaped by our experiences.
And in the end, it seems like the best way to understand the world is to bring these two approaches together.
Exactly.
But what does this all mean for our listeners? How can understanding these ideas change the way they learn and engage with new information?
Well, it's a call to action for all those curious minds out there. Don't just passively take in information. Dig a little deeper.
Think critically.
Right. Consider the source. Think about your own biases and how they might be influencing what you believe.
And don't be afraid to talk to people who see things differently.
That's where real intellectual growth happens.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought. Is it possible to fully integrate the strengths of both phenomenology and hermeneutics?
Can we learn to see with both fresh eyes and an awareness of those colored glasses we all wear?
That's a question worth exploring.
It is.
And we encourage you to keep thinking about these ideas, see what insights you discover.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep those conversations going.